So this one's I heard a fly buzz when I died. It's a strange title. I heard a fly buzz when I died. So you assume that the speaker is in the process of dying and transitioning into the afterlife. And one of the last things that they hear, what they hear at the moment of death, is this fly. So it's quite important to begin with the idea of why a fly in particular. So flies are symbolic of death and decay. They're kind of born from decaying matter. So they represent the life cycle of an individual or of a living thing as it kind of passes into death and begins that process of decay. So we can call this poem a memento mori poem. That's a really good term to use. And it's Latin, it just means remember you will die. And memento mori art or poetry is a type of poem or type of artistic piece that makes the reader or the spectator reflect on mortality. So we look at death and we kind of consider and contemplate death in life. So it sounds quite morbid and gross and scary. Maybe a lot of people don't really want to contemplate death or kind of think too much about it, which is, fair enough. The idea of memento mori is that it makes you appreciate your life a bit more because you're essentially aware that you're going to die. So you make your life count. You don't just sort of, carry on existing as if you're never going to not exist one day. So the point of memento mori is that even though there's a sense of macabre and kind of uncomfortableness with this idea of death or with the theme of death, it's important to sort of sit with that and consider it from time to time, especially in the 19th century when everyone's sort of dying all the time. So Dickinson would be completely surrounded by death. She writes a lot about grief and loss and the process of mourning. All of those are quite relevant to the psyche of her culture at the time, but they're also personal to her and her experiences in life. So it's sort of about processing the idea of death and embracing the idea of death. So we've got this idea of the fly buzzing and making this kind of like annoying noise while everything else is still at the moment of death. The stillness in the room, the stillness in the air, between the heaves of storm. So storm in Dickinson, very often storms represent chaos and kind of tempestuousness. So there's the chaos of life, the chaos of death, and this moment of stillness in between, kind of like the calm at the eye of the storm, or the phrase the calm before the storm. And the fly interposes, it kind of interjects and fills that noise, fills that space with noise, that still space. So there's a lot of figures around, and there's eyes and breaths. So the synecdoche of these words represents the fact that there's a lot of eyes watching the speaker as she dies, and there's a lot of spectators or lots of breaths gathering firm for that last onset, for the last moment of life. And she also wills away her keepsakes. So she makes a will and she has all of her material possessions on earth. She says goodbye to those. So there's a sense that when you die, you take material possessions with you. So you will those to other people, you give them to other people. And as she's giving away the portions of herself that she is able to give away, the things that belong to her that she wants to bestow upon others, a fly comes with blue uncertain stumbling buzz between the light and herself. So the light symbolizes, again, that kind of idea of the light at the end of the tunnel, or the light of heavens, the divine light, the idea of transcending or ascending. And then suddenly this fly comes in, and this moment of death that should be so serene and transcendent gets interrupted, and it becomes a little bit disrupted, or it's sort of unexpected, or kind of almost like a comic bathos at the end, like an anticlimax. So it's this moment of death. It's meant to be kind of this epic, grand moment in a person's existence, and this fly just kind of comes in, ruins it all. So it's comic in a way, but also kind of tragicomic, and it's playing around with the seriousness of death or the importance of death also the lack of meaning or the lack of certainty of existence or what happens after death. So it's kind of in some ways poking fun at and satirizing people's fixation with death in this time, because the 19th century is a time where people are really obsessed, really preoccupied with death, but at the same time exploring quite abstract potential spiritual concepts to do with what happens when you move on. So we can think maybe as well that she might be a kind of ghost, this speaker, because she's talking to us in essence from beyond the grave. Because you've got, when I died is an unusual opening for someone to be narrating a scene to us. There's also this idea of her fixating hypothetically on the moment of death and the anxieties around that. Like, what if it doesn't go right? What if something kind of messes up and I don't end up in heaven? Or the people who are going to mourn me aren't potentially able to mourn me. So there's a sort of interruption of that kind of grand process of death with something more mundane and also something more chaotic, like the fly that appears and the buzz that interrupts that kind of serene spiritual silence that should provide clarity at that moment of death. So you can do a little task to sort of think about this character of the speaker. What sort of person do you think she is, and what types of ways that she speaks lead you to understand her character? It's good to do that with all Dickinson poems, because you'll get a lot more into the psyche of the poet by thinking of the speaker as a character and then trying to kind of picture what character they are. She writes in a few different personas, so even if you think that you've already thought about Dickinson as a person before, you'll notice that her persona shifts from poem to poem. So there's slightly different personalities or kind of like aspects of her character that come out in different poems. And sometimes she's not even speaking as herself, she's speaking in a character. So yeah, there's kind of like an interesting tension between a sort of pessimism and absurdism and kind of grand ideas juxtaposed with mundane ideas. So there's this kind of tension between light and dark, between clarity and obscurity, going the whole way through. So you can kind of think about the juxtaposition of those two things as well. And the fly, I kind of noticed as a motif, appears and ends the poem sort of in a cyclical structure. So if you want to do a structural analysis of this one, you can think about the beginning and end, starting and ending with this idea of the fly. And it's almost as if the fly is part of a life cycle. I think the idea that, there's a sort of breakdown of matter and a decay that is symbolized by the fly, and that gets reconfigured into new life and new energy. So it's maybe a more atheistic look, like a less grand, less spiritual look at life and death, and a more kind of practical, sort of worldly look at that process. So just to sort of finish off then, you might notice the rhyme scheme. There's a roughly regular rhyme scheme with A, B, C, B structure. And then the last stanza, second to last stanza, sorry, penultimate stanza has a little variation on this line. It's when the fly comes in that this order gets disrupted. So again, the idea of this fly as a kind of harbinger of chaos and a disruptor of expected routines is quite interesting there, because it even happens with the rhyming structure when the fly appears. So I think some of the messages or the deeper inherent meanings here, you always have to be careful, because Dickinson doesn't really know herself as she goes through life. She's very exploratory of different ideas without, fully committing to one philosophy or one way of being, because I think for her that the sort of questions about life and death and the nature of existence, they're so hard to answer. She doesn't actually feel qualified as an individual to answer those, because she's quite a humble person. So instead of coming up with a concrete answer, it's more about her exploring potentialities and different ways of thinking and conceptualizing things like life and death and mortality, and how you process grief and mourning. So there is a sense, though, that the physical world distracts us from the spiritual. So she's trying to focus on her spirituality. She's trying to see the light and be all transcendent. And this fly just keeps getting in the way. And the fly is just a worldly, mundane interposition or kind of, interjection upon her spiritual process. So it's almost a metaphor for how if you're trying to be more spiritual and focus on those kind of grand ideas in your life, worldly stuff just gets in the way and disrupts you. And there's also a sense that it's deliberately difficult to conceptualize what happens when you die and what will happen to your experience at that point. And so all we can do is kind of hope and prepare for what we think is the right answer. But it's almost impossible to be dogmatic about it, to be absolute and 100% sure what's going to happen. So there's a kind of puritanical setting around Amherst, Massachusetts, which is where Dickinson lives in this time, which is the kind of mid 1800s. And Puritans are really, really absolutist with their religion, and they're 100% sure what happens, and anything that contradicts their worldview or their religious spiritual views, they're really kind of critical or distrusting of that. So Dickinson, who's a more playful and less certain person, is kind of reacting to the Puritanism or against the Puritanism of her society as well at that point. So the poem's written in 1862, which is around the start of the American Civil War. And so it could also be a kind of interpretation of the absurdity of life and death, and how life and death is kind of random at certain points, especially when wars are going on and people are kind of chaotically dying, and you don't know if your loved ones are going to live or die. You don't even know if you're going to live or die, or what world's going to end up like once the war is over, because the end of a war signifies a huge restructuring of life. You can interpret it as a kind of absurdist reaction to the chaos of war as well. So hopefully I've given you some things to think about with this poem and you enjoy it. I really like this one. It's not an easy one. It's quite difficult to pin down deliberately. So don't try to kind of say this means that with it, because you'll get kind of stuck. Just try and be open to different possibilities with exploring it. But yeah, hopefully you find the fly quite funny. And the idea is kind of interesting and thought-provoking. So yeah, thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys soon.